As you can imagine, the ocean is quite the interesting place. Full of surprises and mysteries, it's definitely a very scary place. I thought some of these stories were pretty interesting. So in today's episode of Stories, let's take a listen to some stories from the ocean. I hope you guys enjoy. Number 1. I'm a sailor, and this happened in the summer of 2012. It's quite the strange one. I was lucky enough to join a voyage. It was amazing, actually. I was on deck and I was on watch, which lasted from 8 p.m. to 12 a.m. I usually volunteer for deck watch, where you look out for debris, other boats, and whatever the instruments don't catch. The trip was actually pretty fun, though generally uneventful, until this fateful Saturday. It's 11:30 p.m., and there's moonlight, some clouds, and stars. I could see quite clearly, so as per usual, I volunteered for deck watch so I could skip out on any serious responsibility. Mind you, I was 17 years old at the time. I'm leaning against the forward mast, gazing at the horizon and humming songs to myself. My eyes change from port to starboard and up and down until they lock on a cloud that's cruising along the sky. Suddenly, the clouds part, and a long blue streak descends all the way down into the horizon. Was it a shooting star, I thought? No, the sky flashed a bright blue as well. Could it have been lightning, I thought? No, the night was calm and this beam was perfectly straight. I was sitting in blank awe for a couple of moments. Then I immediately ran for my watch officer. Everyone on watch that night was standing up with their mouths wide open, and we were all exchanging glances. I broke the silence and then asked what it was. My watch officer, let's call him Jake, shakes his head and tells me he doesn't know. That's when he taps another officer, telling him to wake up the captain. I went down into the cabin to see if I could steal a peek at the sonar. You see, only officers could be around the instruments. The only thing is, nothing was on the scope. At the end of the day, the captain ended up telling everybody that it was no big deal, and to carry on. I know what we saw. It was definitely something unexplained. It was definitely something I'll never forget. Number 2. I circumnavigated the globe from the ages of 23 to 25 on my 43-foot sailboat. One of the scariest incidents we had was when we were leaving port in the middle of the night. Aside from the constant thing of Frogger dodging freighters, our path was fairly straightforward. At about 3 a.m., I was alone at the helm, with everybody else asleep down below. Suddenly, I hear a beep from the radar, which had been set to warn about anything within a quarter mile of our vessel. Looking around, I couldn't find anything obvious within that range, so I put the boat on autopilot and went down below to investigate. Typically, other boats show up as little blobs, but for some reason, the radar was registering a long, solid line, the length of the screen and directly in front of us. As we were going more further, it was getting closer and fast. My heart was racing, and I went back on deck to see what could possibly be doing this. My eyes were slowly adjusting, and that's when I looked into the dark, peering as hard as I could see, but there's nothing. Then all of a sudden, I saw it. Not more than 100 yards ahead was a 20-foot-high, unlit rock-solid wall. This was right in the middle of the ocean, looming and by this point, making its presence known by the sound of waves lapping against it. I was absolutely petrified. Mind you, this was before chalk plotters were widely used, and we were navigating with paper charts. As you can imagine, I was utterly confused and supremely scared. I called all hands on deck, and that's when we stopped the boat. We then proceeded to pull down the sails and started the engine. Slowly but surely, we picked our way through what was by that time an increasingly apparent thing, a full-on construction zone. Our charts were only 2 years old, but apparently this area had undergone a monumental land reclamation, or as I called it, nuclamation. It looked like this was a project in the meantime. Well, even once we found our way out, nobody slept for the rest of the night. To this day, the image of magically appearing dark walls in the middle of the ocean haunts my dreams. Number 3. This was down in La Jolla, California. They have caves along the coast that you can swim through, if the tides are right. This particular day, the water level was high enough that you could swim through this one cave that was pretty narrow. Well, it's my turn to swim, And when I'm halfway through, a set wave comes in and clears the cave while I'm still in it. Well, as you can imagine, I was smashed up against the side of the cave, and I ended up getting a couple cuts. I was thinking though, well, why not? We're still here, let's keep going. Well, we were planning on swimming out to a buoy and then back to the shore. Now, with exposed cuts on me, and with this area known for great white sightings, I continue on my way. Well, we get to the buoy, and I just have the biggest sense of dread. We're about a good 15-minute swim from shore, and that's when I start thinking about the cuts on my arm. I tell myself, this could be a serious issue. This area is full of sharks, and they might be attracted by the blood. Sure enough, I'm looking down and I see something swimming towards me. It's dark. I'm like, whatever. I start swimming away from it. That's when I turn around and I see two more of the same things coming right at me. My face goes completely pale. I'm expected to get grabbed and pulled under and never seen again. Well, thankfully nothing happens. My friends can see the look on my face and they're asking me what happened. We all decide to swim in together, and my friends were all better swimmers than me. But on that day, I beat them back to shore easily. I'm practically kissing the sand when I finally made it to shore. This old man comes up to me and says, you shouldn't be swimming with that cut on your arm. You're attracting sharks. Yeah, needless to say, I'm never going to do that again. Number 4. This happened a little while ago. I was diving in the ocean and we were at a side diving where there were 2 steep hills underwater that were full of rock formations and coral. Between these 2 areas was a sandy bottom, which was scattered with rocks ranging between 1 to 5 meters across. Plus, they were full of holes and full of life. So we were swimming from one hill to the next, and we were just inspecting the rocks along the way. I was swimming along one of the large ones, and that's when I get whacked in the side of my stomach very hard. It startled me, and I quickly backed off. The dive instructor noticed and he came over and we inspected what happened. But that's when a gigantic moray eel came out of nowhere. It was absolutely massive, never seen one so big. It was easily a couple meters in length and was probably as wide as my head. Well, we assumed I had passed too close to him without noticing, and that's why he attacked. To this day, I'm just thankful he didn't do any more. Who knows what would have happened to me. Number 5. I was diving off the coast of Fiji, and we went through a natural tunnel. This was like a 10-meter cave/passage that went through a rock formation. So we start swimming through the cave and suddenly the light was weird, like the blue tint from the water had been replaced by a red one. Now, all divers will know that this isn't only weird because the color changed, but also because red is the first color to disappear after a certain depth, usually between 30 feet, which is 10 meters, and 40 feet, which is 13 meters. Plus, we were over 70 feet down. Also bear in mind, this was late morning on a sunny day. So imagine this scene. Me and my dive buddy are going through an underwater cave, and suddenly everything, for no apparent reason, is tinted red, a color that you're literally supposed to not be able to see at that depth. Upon exiting the cave, everything was back to blue. I thought it was just me, so I didn't signal to go back up. After the dive, my buddy asked me if I'd seen the water tint red too. To this day, we can't explain it, and the folks from the local dive shop have no idea what we're talking about. If anybody has any idea, we would like to know. Number 6. This was maybe about 10 years ago, and I was sailing with my family and moving a sailboat from the Connecticut shore all the way to Boston. I remember this happened on an extremely foggy day, and also, I remember the day being pretty windless as well, so we were just motoring along instead of sailing. Now, the general procedure for sailing in such thick fog is to use radar and foghorns to try to prevent any collisions. At some point, we started hearing huge loud horn blasts, just repeating from somewhere to our right in the fog. It seemed normal enough. Somebody was signaling their position to anybody in the vicinity. Then after maybe 15 to 20 minutes of sailing, we eventually found the source. Maybe 100 feet from the boat was a huge black object that looked like it was just sitting there. The weirdest part of this whole thing was just its sudden appearance. Now, maybe it's not the scariest thing to ever happen, but an enormous black shape appearing out of the fog at sea was pretty scary to me at the time. Number 7. I remember really loving to go for swims in the ocean as a kid. Nowadays, though, the thought scares me. One of my earlier memories of bathing in the ocean comes from 1999. Our family was on vacation, and we were eating dinner at a restaurant with this Danish family we just met. It was pretty late at night, and the adults were talking about some boring stuff. So the son came up to me and he asked me if I wanted to go for a swim. Now, me being 7 years old, I was totally down for this, so we both went out to the beach. This was pretty much in the middle of the night, and the island nights, as you can imagine, are pretty dark. So it was just the two of us, alone on a pristine white beach, and the moon was barely lighting up the massive sea. Needless to say, we thought it was awesome, so we dived into the water. After a while, one of us noticed a stack of white plastic chairs and suggested we should try dragging one into the water and see if it would float. This sounded like a sweet idea, and so we tried it, and lo and behold, not only did it float, but it could also support the weight of both of us. So at that point, we simultaneously had the same idea: pirates. So we both got into this thing, and as it drifted off into the ocean, we were singing pirate songs. Then after a good while, I noticed the lights from the island were getting pretty distant. In retrospect, we probably weren't farther out than 200 yards at this point, but to a 7-year-old, that's still pretty far. I suggested that we should start paddling back ashore, and my new friend concurred. The thing is, we couldn't. Our raft wouldn't have any of it, and to our best efforts, we just kept drifting further and further away. We spent the night on that beach chair. Even at that young age, I realized that if I fell asleep, I would fall into the water. My friend was crying, but whenever I tried moving over to comfort him, the raft was moving. So we just both sat there, crying away as our raft kept drifting further out into the ocean. When the sun came up, I couldn't see the island. In fact, I couldn't see any land at all. I'll never forget that. It was just the massive blue sky and the massive blue ocean. So here we were, scared out of our minds in the middle of the ocean. Thankfully for us, though, we were spotted by a crew of a fishing boat. One of them jumped into the water, tied a rope to our raft, and hauled us in. As you can imagine, we were pretty thankful for that. But unfortunately, none of them spoke English. But luckily, though, they were able to contact the island we were staying on, and they told us that they would bring us in. They gave us water and some cookies, and we promptly fell asleep. 20 hours after the start of our jolly adventure, we were thankfully reunited with our families. Since then, I haven't gone back into the ocean. Number 8. I used to do saturation diving, and I did work on rigs. Now let me tell you, it's pretty scary down there. No particular scary sea monster story, but it's not a nice place. For one, it's super dark. It's absolutely dark, and your lamp barely goes more than a few yards effectively. The water is filled with particles, so it's kind of like shining a light into smoke. It's seriously like being in a void, and the only things in the void are you and the rig. I never disconnected from it longer than I had to, though. It's just, well, it just feels like you can fall forever. As scary sea monsters go, I never really did see any. Don't get me wrong, I saw a lot of things. The mixture you're breathing combined with the pressure can really obviously mess with your senses. It's happened more than a few times. I've seen something big and fast-moving just beyond my line. Sound doesn't really travel well in water, but you can hear the rig popping and other crazy things. It's always really deep in tones, too. Also, you see a bunch of really weird fish down here. No joke, divers usually see a lot of fish that aren't identified. The aquanauts have to do what they can, but unfortunately, they're not allowed to come down here. So, we just have to live with these unidentified fish. We named a few, but you don't really see them often and rarely more than once or twice. Some fish, in fact, are drawn to the lamp, but others stay away from it. I think the most interesting thing, though, is just how deep it is down there and what it does to your brain. When you've been out in the water for a while, and literally only you and the piece of metal you're clinging to are the only things that seem to exist, well, your brain tries to fill the void. At least, I hope it was my brain doing that. The rig popping is really ominous, because it's like a bass drum that's all around you, and the only sound in almost absolute silence. You can see things moving in the dark, and when you look at them, your lamp only goes 10 yards or so, and all it's hitting are the particles I mentioned before. This happens a few times, and you're certain you're not alone down there. It honestly feels like you're being followed. Now, a lot of people get lost down here, because they try and rush to see what's down here, but that's not something you should do. You kinda have to get it in your head and say, well, I hope it doesn't eat me, and you just have to keep working. To be honest, it can be hard not to panic. They teach you tactical breathing both to conserve and to keep you from losing it, but it's still hard to do. You start focusing really hard on tactical breathing, but you swear you saw something on the edge of your vision. You felt like the water move against your back, and heard it move. Well, another story that came to mind. I was out doing my job one time in the absolute darkness of the void. I'd been out a good 30 or 40 minutes, and that's when I saw something swish over to the top of my vision. I looked around, but I couldn't see anything. It scared me pretty good, and so I just focused on my tactical breathing and not losing my fingers. A minute passed, and I saw something go a little behind my pylon and down. I was 100% sure it was a kraken or something. Another minute passes, and this 2 or so foot fish comes swimming up to me. It was a weird looking fish, pale and long, and skinny with big eyes and a bigger mouth. It just kinda darted around me for a bit, just hanging out with me for a while, and when it was done, he took off. I told the story to a buddy of mine, and he suggested that the fish hung around me because of my light. As I mentioned before, a lot of things don't approach the light down there, and he was probably using me for shelter for something bigger and meaner. Just thinking about that, though, absolutely scares me. On the topic of this job, the pay was pretty good, but it was definitely scary. I know many people got injured that I personally knew, and one panicked while he was working. I think the closest that I ever got to getting injured was one time when I went on an excursion. I was going down several feet into different areas as I was trying to test out some equipment. Unfortunately for me, though, I got stuck in some equipment. Now I got tangled pretty bad, but it's not really hard to get out of. Thankfully for me, though, I had plenty of oxygen left, but just imagine if I didn't. I'll tell you, tactical breathing is definitely a lifesaver, and something I'm thankful for knowing. Number 9. I have a friend who has sailed the seas his whole life, on a boat that he built himself. He used to pick up a bit of money by taking backpackers and adventurers on all these cruises around the world. He would go from the Pacific to the Atlantic and all the way around. They would pay him, but also had to crew the boat, so on any trip, he might be the only experienced sailor. There was one time he was sailing in the Pacific Ocean. As is sometimes the case in the Pacific, the wind has pretty much calmed down at this point, and the sea was like a sheet of glass. They are proceeding under power, chugging along on the diesel at about 2 to 3 knots. It's very hot and they have lunch and everybody goes below for a nap, except for one guy. He's on watch for the next hour or so. The guy is bored and pretty much thinks a swim would feel good. Well, why not? The boat is barely moving and he's a good swimmer. Plus, he thinks he could just pop in and swim along the side a bit and then climb back out. When the watch bell rings and my friend comes back on deck, he finds nobody at the tiller. He quickly turns the boat around and calls all hands on deck and maps a course. Luckily for them, though, the water is pretty calm and the sun is now at their backs. But finding a man who has gone overboard is difficult, even in the best conditions. You see, only about 6 inches of your head actually shows up in the water when you're swimming, so it's not much more than a floating coconut. Even in a calm sea, it's pretty difficult to see a person overboard. Plus, this guy has no life vest or even high visibility gear on. Plus, they don't even know when he went over. By some miracle, after about 30 minutes or so of sailing back, somebody spots the guy treading water. He was shaking and he had tears streaming down his face. When he got off the boat to swim, he realized almost immediately that it was going faster than he could swim. He shouted and swam after it, but the motor was on and the crew were all below decks. Thankfully for him, though, we were able to spot him before anything else happened. Number 10. The ocean is such a beautiful place. Plus, it's very isolated too. Well, while surfing aboard a boat and weathering a storm a ways off the coast, I saw lightning hit the top of a wave that was looming 50 feet away from our boat. It was beautiful, and the instant I saw it, I knew that I would never see anything else like it again. There were shows of lightning reaching down into that wave for at least dozens of feet. It was like looking at brilliantly glowing mountains of emerald and jade, a brilliantly glowing mountain that you could easily fall in love with. The instant the lightning faded, the boat plowed into that wave, bow on, and the wave broke over the 3rd level of the superstructure. It was 3 stories up from the main deck. I was on the 3rd level, and if not for the safety strap, I would have been lost. At that time, I'd never seen such beautiful weather before. Over 100 feet of bow forward of the superstructure, speared into that wave, and when it broke over the windbreak, I'll tell you, it's like something you've never seen before. Honestly, it was like colliding into a barrier. The hull rang from the impact, and the boat lost almost all forward momentum immediately. It then began to groan and shudder a bit as it let out tons of water. There were many other waves that night, but I know which one left the inch-wide cracks in the superstructure. I know the ocean contains such beautiful scenery, but at the same time, it can be quite the scary place. Bonus story. I recently left my job as a diver. I worked for a large company that offers diving services ranging from salvage, underwater demolition, repairs, and search and recovery. They are a reputable company that are considered safe and reliable. So much so, they are often contracted by so many people. Truth be told, I will miss working for them. The only thing is, there are only so many unexplainable things that you can witness in the ocean before you decide to stay out of the ocean forever. Here are just some of the examples of the secrets many divers take with them. On the way to a job, we were contracted to perform. I suited up and prepared to make a quick dive to remove the fouling. I did a brief inspection and located thick line wrapped around the prop. I notified the supervisor, who then lowered a canvas bag with the tools I needed to cut it off. I hung the bag from the prop and began freeing the propeller. It didn't take long, and I returned to my tool bag. That's when I noticed a strange crunching sound when I dropped the tools in the bag. When I looked into the bag, it was full of large shells, many of which I just crushed. After getting out of the water and taking off my gear, I began examining them. The shells had what appeared to be hieroglyphics etched into them. I learned from one of the senior guys that this wasn't common, but had happened to several of them before. On one other occasion, we were recovering an aircraft. When we arrived, boats were on the scene waiting for us to recover it. We were quickly briefed that they had lost communication with the pilot and wanted us to recover it so they could investigate. I was sitting comms and logs, and that's when the divers reached the project. They reported that the plane was indeed intact. We were all surprised. The supervisor asked how extensive the damage was. That's when they explained that it was completely intact. As in, there was no visible damage at all. It was just resting on the bottom. And even stranger, the aircraft canopy was still in place. Well, eventually, we ended up recovering the plane and they ended up taking custody of it. After that, we never heard about it again. As for another time, I witnessed another strange occurrence from the top side of the location of a planned demolition. Now, it's necessary to explain that one way you can keep track of a diver is to watch their bubble stream. When a diver inhales, the helmet's demand regulator provides air. Then when they exhale, it's exhausted into the water and floats up to the surface. On top side, you can watch the bubbles to get a general sense of where the divers are. Now on this occasion, we were hundreds of miles from the land and placed 2 divers in the water. About an hour into the dive, we started noticing something strange was happening. There were 3 distinct bubble streams that were coming from where they were working. At first, we assumed that there was a current and it was affecting them. But soon, we noticed a 4th set of bubbles coming from a distance. It stopped about 20 feet from the divers and near the other mysterious bubbles. We ended up telling the divers, but neither could see anything out of the ordinary. Then, even from the surface, we heard curdling screeches from the waters. Then silence. The divers weren't too concerned. We hear strange things all the time. You see, sound travels well in the water, and you learn to assume it's a long distance away. But soon, it looked like the water in the distance was boiling, and it was getting closer. The only thing is, it wasn't boiling. It was countless new bubble streams, moving nearer to the location of where our divers were working. The supervisor ordered the divers to get onto the dive stage so they could be lifted back to surface. The bubbles were a lot closer now, and the divers that were being lifted out said they began to see shadow figures in the distance. They couldn't quite make out what they were seeing, but either way, we decided to pull them out. During another dive near the Bahamas, I had another experience. It was my first salvage job with them, so I got in with a highly experienced diver. At just over 200 feet deep, we were examining the sunken vessel for rigging points. As I approached the bow, I noticed he was investigating a damaged portion of the hull. He swam for a few feet looking into the boat. That's when I asked him if he needed help with his air supply hose. Now, I really don't need to tell you this, but as you can imagine, it's pretty dangerous to enter a sunken vessel. He didn't want to enter the boat. Instead, he insisted that we go to the port side of the boat. Assuming he was disorientated, I reached in to grab him. Well, needless to say, he definitely wasn't having any of it, and we decided to go report what we saw. Now, here's another case. I'm not entirely sure how to explain this next one. I ended up entering the water with another diver. Well, on the bottom, we ended up finding 3 dolls. We placed them in bags and returned to the stage. Now, we were sent down here to find various treasures and other things, but to find these strange dolls down here is definitely not only scary, but it leaves you questioning, why would there be random dolls at the bottom of the ocean? Yeah, as I've told you, I've experienced quite the strange phenomena down here. Number 12. I've had quite the experiences in the ocean. Here are just a few. One incident took place about a year ago. During a salvage job, we were in the process of installing the rigging gear. While facing the boat and with my back to the open ocean, I hadn't noticed anything approaching. Suddenly, something smashed into the tank of my back, and it was hard. I was also slammed into the boat and flattened against it by force. I turned around and there was nothing. I would later learn that I had several bruised ribs from the impact. Well, after reporting to the other diver on topside, we were told they were going to pull us out. We got back onto the stage and started being lifted toward the surface. We kept our eyes peeled, scanning into the not-too-distant shadows. And during a decompression stop, we began seeing a shadowy figure circling around us. We began to monitor it as it circled closer and closer. Then, we began to see it more clearly. There was a massive shark circling us. Now, I've never been afraid of sharks, but there's something about being circled by a massive shark in the middle of the ocean, dangling from a chain that can instill a new phobia in the bravest man. Keep in mind, we aren't in an enclosed cage, just a platform to stand on. It felt like being served on a platter. It eventually circled close enough that we could see its features, but I didn't recognize its species. It was bigger than a great white, with entirely different coloration too. It was mostly dark, with a few gray features. Well, it continued eyeing us as we sat there helpless, hoping that this thing would go away. By the time we completed our decompression, it was nearly close enough to touch. The stage lifted us up out of the water, relieved that the shark had not decided to find out how we taste. On surface, we deduced that the shark had lunged at my back, but it only managed to hit the emergency gas supply cylinder. Number 13. One of my first experiences was scuba diving. I decided to go dive the cave with my buddy since we'd done it earlier that day when the conditions were great. We didn't lay a line either, because there was a pipe along the floor of the cave, which we saw on our previous trip. Now this was a huge no-no. We assumed this pipe began at the entrance and went straight back into the end of the cave. The owners installed it as a water vacuum to help clean the deepest parts of this cave. Now on this day, there had been a high volume of students diving in the cavern. This, unfortunately, ended up bringing a lot of sand into the cave, so you could barely see. Now this is crucial, because the cavern portion is where you just swim towards the sunlight, and this is on a normal dive. And to add to all of this, we dove in the evening, not realizing that the sun would have set when we were heading out. Well, we began the dive confidently, trusting our misguided failsafe, and swam into the cavern. That's when both of us noticed how silty it now was, but we figured, hey, you can still see the surface from here. Thanks, son. And we continued towards the cave. Once inside, we swam down to the end of the cave. This was about 200 feet back. Then we decided to turn around and began to exit. The closer we got to the exit, the worse the visibility got, and by the time we noticed the light at the end of the tunnel wasn't coming, the vis was barely 2 feet. Undeterred, we grabbed onto the pipe and followed, hand over hand, to where we assumed the pipe would reach the surface. This was the point where we hit a barrier, literally. This pipe, which we had assumed had led us to the surface, instead made a bend to a shallower passage of the cave, where it entered the ceiling and disappeared. In the terrible vis, we followed it into a passage we'd never seen before, in a part of the cave that was a complete end. I'll never forget the feeling of dread that hit me, but the most memorable moment was making eye contact with my buddy and we realized what was going on. Most cave accidents are instantaneous, but in cave diving, it's a whole completely different thing. So we kept going. Survival instincts set in, and we refused to wait. Instead, we started crawling in near zero visibility over every part of the cave to find the exit. Now, the most ironic part that saved our life was a sign warning people of the dangers of the cave. We saw it, and we were able to make our way out. Well, thankfully, we made it out fine. A month later, I got my cave certification. I was called a dummy for doing what I did, and learned to never make the same mistake twice. Number 14. A friend of mine asked me to help deliver a sailboat. I was a somewhat inexperienced sailor, and only sailed for fun a few times. Plus, they were short trips. But there was one time where he paid me $100 a day, so I said why not. I was between two jobs. It was three of us. Me, my captain, who was a very experienced sailor, and the new owner of the boat. Once we got to the Anna Maria Island on the west coast of Florida, we prepared for the longest haul of our trip. This was the first time away from the coast. Well, we did 4-hour turns. Then you get to sleep or do whatever for the next 8 hours, until your next 4 hours were up. Well, the eerie part for me was the nighttime. It was alone, and it was in the absolute darkness. Now, you also have to avoid a lot of small oil rigs. Some still active, some not active, and some marked with lights and some not. There were times where you would hear unexplainable sounds. Now, I don't know if my head was just messing with me or not, but it was pretty scary to me. Towards the end of my turn, we hit some pretty bad rain and rough seas. My captain eventually took over, and I went to bed. Well, eventually, I get woken up a bit later to some crazy rough seas. I go back on deck, and my captain and the owner of the boat are just yelling. They tell me we have to turn back, and they tell us we lost our GPS. Apparently, the wind had knocked it off the top of the mast and into the ocean. So there we are now, rough seas, in the absolute darkness with no GPS. Now, luckily for us, my captain is pretty old school, and knows how to sail with just a chart. So we ended up making it back to Anna Maria and purchased a new GPS. The whole event was just so surreal, and I was definitely worried a few times. The rest of the trip was uneventful, and the next nights had nice bright moons, calm seas, and that of course made it a little less eerie. Number 15. So this one's a bonus story. Now, you know how mail is one of those things that most people don't think about when going out to sea? Well, the ocean is a vast place, and there's no postal service in existence to deliver the mail. In order to address this problem, a system of delivering mail buoys has been implemented and is used by most modern people. Cargo planes regularly make drops of floating buoys, which have their drop locations transmitted so that the appropriate boats can rendezvous and pick up the mail. These are difficult to see due to size and weight restrictions aboard aircraft, so junior personnel on board boats are often assigned a mail buoy watch. They pretty much have to stand outside to help spot it when the boats are due to pick up mail. Unfortunately, sometimes the mail never makes it due to getting lost or being unable to be spotted over the years. So, one of the scariest and weirdest things is seeing the ocean being accumulated by hundreds if not thousands of mail buoys that are floating around. If you're lucky, you might someday run into one of these buoys and get to find some of the old mail. I really do want to find out what's in some of that mail and would like to read it to you one day. I just wanted to go ahead and say thank you so much to all the Patreons who donated this past month. Thank you so much for donating, guys. And for those of you guys who do donate, you guys get some pretty awesome cool perks and rewards, like getting my videos way earlier than everybody else, getting my autograph, and even getting a personal handwritten letter from myself. So if you haven't checked out my Patreon or haven't donated, then make sure you guys do, as like I said, I've got some pretty cool rewards and perks for you guys that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Other than that, guys, thank you very much.